Hello and welcome to Forward. Our guest today is Chris Sestito, the founder and CEO of HiddenLayer. HiddenLayer helps enterprises safeguard the machine learning models behind their most important products with a comprehensive security platform. Chris is a certified ethical hacker and worked in various senior roles in threats research and data science before co-founding HiddenLayer with Tanner Burns and Jim Ballard. In this episode, we talk about rapidly growing threats organizations face from attacks on their AI systems. We discuss different types of attacks and how to address them. We also talk about how Chris became interested in cybersecurity, what kind of people he's looking for when building his team, and how poker skills can be applied to fight bad actors in cyberspace. Tito, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Artem. Glad to be here.
Let's start with an overview of AI security as a field. We're in the early days of this discipline, but as AI systems adoption grows, it will become a critical component of cybersecurity. Why is security important, and what types of organizations should pay attention?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's really important when you think about any sort of emerging technology just to embrace history and understanding what we've learned about the past. As we take steps forward and engage in new technologies, they end up becoming new attack vectors as well. So even as recent as looking at sort of our commitment to cloud technology, we start to see new attack vectors. And so we really just need to understand sort of lessons learned. And AI is absolutely going to be the same scenario, especially when you think about just the unprecedented rate of adoption of AI and ML technology. It's the fastest growing technology we've ever seen. And we're finding many, many new ways to leverage it, which is fantastic, but we're also exposing it. And so when we think about security for artificial intelligence, many folks think about sort of it's very complex, it's very sort of high level and new, but in reality, just like every other way, we've seen different types of technology attacked, and we've seen different sort of automations associated with those attacks. We're seeing that exact same thing. We're starting to see tools to make it easier when we're seeing it become more and more accessible. So we really need to protect it. We need to treat it like any other type of new technology, except for the fact that this is growing even faster than those. So it becomes a very, very important issue.
Do you see organizations currently understand any of those risks and address them in any way?
It's a really great question. And there's really sort of a full spectrum of response there. I think your organizations that have very mature data science teams are very aware of how vulnerable they are. And that was one of the biggest surprises to us at HiddenLayer when we came out of stealth. We were thinking we were going to have to do a lot of education right out of the gate to show everybody how exposed they are and really how dangerous this path is if we don't take the right responsible steps. But what we found was that organizations with mature data science teams reached out to us and said, hey, we know this is an issue and we don't really know what to do about it. So I think there are some that are very sort of forward thinking in this space and treating it like other technologies and really embracing sort of ML ops, which is really, about 3-4 years started gaining popularity. And that's really sort of like DevOps for machine learning. And you start to think about how to operationalize your machine learning assets and your implementations. And many groups are thinking about that for things like reliability, for things like improving their efficacy, for things like efficiencies and deployments, training new models, that kind of thing. But we need to get security in there. We need to understand sort of how to make sure they're secure with that same level of maturity and implementation that we have in things like DevOps. So some of your organizations that are really thinking about this problem at a mature level are absolutely thinking about it. Some organizations even have data science security teams. They've mostly been focusing on it sort of like inside the model outward and taking more academic approaches to the problem. And there's plenty of white papers out there and research to suggest different things you can do in building your model to make it a little bit more resistant to these types of attacks. But they haven't really been thinking about it too much in terms of like a true security solution to prevent these attacks. And that's ultimately what we've determined is required in any other sort of asset that you want to protect. So there are some organizations, the forward-thinking ones, that are absolutely aware of this as an issue. And then there are many organizations that just haven't prioritized it. I don't think anybody's putting their head in the sand and saying, there's no way my ML can be attacked. But there are many different sort of priorities for any sort of organization now, both on the data science side and both on the security side. So I would say that when you bring this to light in front of anybody, even if they haven't been thinking about it, they sort of say, oh, wow, I didn't think about that. And I've been exposing this through my product. But then it sort of becomes very, very at the forefront of their priorities. So I would say there are some organizations that are very, very far along this path and understand that something needs to be done. And there are many who just need to find out where it fits in their priority of protecting their organization.
This situation reminds me a lot what we had when we invested in CyberX a few years ago, when industrial security was also kind of on everyone's mind, but still there were a lot of conflicting priorities, and not necessarily industrial security was the most important, or at that moment it wasn't maybe perceived as the thing to act now. That, of course, changed over the next few years. Now everyone appreciates the importance of industrial cybersecurity. And likely the field of AI security will go through the same evolution. Let's unpack some of the stuff we just discussed. There are different types of attacks. There are different types of colors that those attacks are being described by, like white, gray, black. Can you talk about what those mean and what kind of specific attacks exist in each group?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll answer that question sort of in two ways. There's sort of the lens at which you look at for how much the attacker understands about the target. And that's what you mean when you're saying this is a black box attack or a white box attack or somewhere in the middle, that we refer to it as a gray box attack. And then there's also sort of what types of attacks are out there in terms of the actual techniques and tactics associated with it. So we'll start sort of by saying, let's look at it from what the attacker understands. So if you are an insider threat, or you have some sort of strong understanding of what you're up against, that would be considered like a white box attack. And that's when you have full access to the model, the data sets, the MLOps pipeline, and you have a strong understanding of what's there. And oftentimes you're going to see that more in like a red teaming engagement or potentially an insider threat, something along those lines. But the attacker's job is typically they're in a black box scenario where they're trying to, just like any other traditional cybersecurity attack, first they're going to do some reconnaissance. They're going to understand sort of what that looks like, what they're up against, try and understand things like what is the framework that they're working on, what was that model built in, where is it being housed, what kind of framework is that model, is that victim using a well-known model that a lot of organizations are using. So for instance, in today's world, and I think one of the major themes that you're going to see in adversarial machine learning is transfer learning, where you see organizations pre-training models and handing them off to buyers of those models to either further train them or just use them as is. And sometimes that's a proprietary situation, and sometimes that's downloading open source models. But if, for instance, you see an organization using OpenAI's GPT-3 as a sort of a language model there, an attacker wants to understand that, and they want to see if they can figure out what model is being used in production. And then if they do start to see things that would indicate that you are using a well-known, highly accessible model, that gets very close to a white box attack very quickly, because then that attacker can go pull down that open source and available model and start constructing an attack in that regard, and then bring it to that black box location and conduct the attack. So at HiddenLayer, we're seeing a significant amount of this, especially in sort of that transfer learning scenario where you have organizations maybe making facial recognition models and selling them to many, many, many buyers. Well, the attacker is going to go to where that model is most accessible and construct that attack, and then bring it to those buyers who have protected it more and conduct that attack. So that's the scenario. Sort of black box, not a strong understanding. Gray box, you might have a little bit of an understanding. Maybe you understand data that was used to train that model, or maybe you understand certain features that model considers, or maybe you understand the template in which the predictions come out of that model, but you don't have the whole picture. And so that attacker is really trying to progressively move to a larger and larger understanding of the attack surface that they're going after. Now, another sort of side to that is kind of what types of attacks is the attacker going to employ, and there are many of those. And so we typically start with what we call inference, and that's really exactly what it sounds like. The attacker is interacting with the model or the framework that the model is built in to try and infer things about that model, and potentially either take them from that black box scenario into a closer to a white box scenario, or just understand more about areas to attack or what's going to work or what that model considers. So that's essentially the attacker interacting with the model as much as possible, trying to gain labels, trying to infer things like what data it was trained on, trying to infer things like what features or variables the model considers and how important it considers those. And then ultimately trying to understand things like, where is this model weak? Where is this model strong? Where does it have low confidence decision making? Where is it making high confidence decisions? And then ultimately how to tamper with that, or potentially how to steal it and how to recreate a surrogate model. There are many techniques available for this sort of interaction. So it sort of begins with inference, and that's so that the attacker can understand sort of what they're up against. That can be an attack all in itself, But it can then evolve into things like model evasion that we've seen in the security space, where if a vendor is using machine learning models to detect attacks, then the attacker who's performing the adversarial machine learning attack is highly interested in what that model is going to miss altogether. There's essentially tampering, where you're going to try and find out where that model is making weak convictions to sort of switch that manifold over and get the label that you're looking for. So again, in a security scenario, maybe that's an antivirus company that's convicting a threat and you're trying to make them allow a threat. Or maybe in like a fraud scenario, you have a machine learning model that's detecting a transaction as fraud, and the inference attack would be to lay the groundwork to understand exactly where that you could start conducting fraudulent transactions that would fly under the radar of the model, or things you might have to do to those transactions, alter geographies or frequencies or amounts of the transaction that would then ultimately lead to lower confidence areas of that model. So inference really lays the groundwork for what ultimately creates kind of some of those further steps. But then there are many other areas on the machine learning operations pipeline for which you can attack. And you could look at data poisoning, which I believe personally is going to be one of the largest threats that humanity has ever seen when you start to think about all of the different sort of automated data collection and data curation that's out there that then feeds into these continuous learning scenarios. I believe data poisoning is going to be something that you have to try and manage, not something you have to try and avoid. It's going to be like risk. You're going to have certain percentages of your data that you're hoping to remain under in terms of how much of it is poisoned. And you can think about real world scenarios that have happened in the past with things like spam filters. You have organizations that have built machine learning models to identify spam, and they've done so very successfully. And that can be spam for the sake of targeted advertising or spam advertising. And then it can also move into more malicious types of attacks. So you actually have spam organizations spinning up tens of thousands of email accounts and then marking their own spam as not spam in order to poison those models that are still poisoned today, to allow some of these spam filters to go through. So there's many examples of sort of anywhere that data is being collected at scale, and there's sort of automated curation processes and automated labeling. You're going to see poisoning attempts there to ultimately try and tamper with that model from the data augmentation side. And that's very scary, because when you think about how expensive and how drawn out some of these model deployment processes are, it can be very, very expensive. And actually, we've seen that firsthand, where there's organizations that have to make tough decisions around, do we stop everything and rewind the clock on our models and go back and deliver older versions of the model, or do we just accept what's going on now and accept the level of poisoning and try and work ourselves around that, just sort of based on the expenses that can be associated with those major decisions. So really, there's any step around the ML operations pipeline, there's many attacks that can be used. And then actually one of the frameworks that we use and we've built our product around is the MITRE Atlas framework. So many in security are familiar with MITRE ATT&CK, but MITRE has a new group now and a new framework called Atlas, and it's all targeting adversarial machine learning attacks. And they've done a fantastic job itemizing all of those and quantifying all of those techniques and tactics and the definitions associated with them that can be used in adversarial machine learning attacks. So it's a great framework, and it's one that we should all adopt because it really gets us speaking universal language. But if you're interested in seeing all the different components and breakdowns of different areas that can be attacked in an AML approach, then you can check out MITRE Atlas.
Yeah, I'll definitely link it to the show notes so people can check it out.
Fantastic.
We talked about evasion, poisoning. We talked about inference. What is extraction?
So let's say I want to extract information from you. And so that can be sort of intellectual property. That can be the model itself. That can be information that's going through the model, or that can be inferring things about the data set there. So it could be like model theft. Like, let's say you've spent, in some cases, billions of dollars developing these models, but oftentimes many millions of dollars developing a model like that. Maybe I want to have it too, and I don't want to put that kind of research or anything along those lines. So there's a competitive element here. There's certainly a malicious element here, where I can extract how your model makes decisions. I can either build a surrogate model that was trained to reproduce the exact same outputs and predictions that your model is producing. And so I can do it at a lot less of a cost and in much less time if I am stealing it from a model. And then I can also infer things like, what kind of customers and what kind of data is passing through this model to try and understand sort of more information than I should have. And so essentially it's sort of another sort of built-on layer of inference where I can try and extract data or the model itself in order to use that.
Got you. All four sound like a big deal. I agree with you that data poisoning is one of the most treacherous, in a sense that it can be done under the radar for a long time. And then eventually you might discover yourself in a situation where you have to make this terrible decision. You either roll back to a very old and likely out of date model that will work anyway terribly for you.
Well, you bring up a good point too. I mean, I think if you look at like how this can happen over time and how it can happen really under the radar, because I like to say as security operators, I think we've gotten very used to ransomware, which is very loud, very in your face. Nobody isn't aware they've been hit with a ransomware campaign. But if you think back into the days where we had to look for things like backdoors or some of your more subtle types of malware that were intended, like rootkits or what have you, to exist over long periods of time, that's a lot more aligned with what an inference attack can look like, where it can look like collecting data over time or poisoning or tampering over time, and so that's just that much more important, and how much more of a priority this needs to be to start understanding what's going on with your models. Most organizations aren't even logging the data that comes through their models, let alone looking for these types of attacks or anomalies that are existing within them. So it really can be a scenario where if you're not being proactive about identifying this sort of abuse, that it's going to be far too late by the time you even recognize that it's going on. So yeah, that's a great point, because it very much can be under the radar. In fact, these attacks are very often designed to do exactly that and fly under the radar.
That's what I observed too. I see that organizations currently are focused mostly on gathering and cleaning the data for their first models for training purposes, but that's it. They're not looking beyond what's gonna be needed. And they will start very soon, because as soon as they understand the issue, as you said, the more mature organizations understand it already because they already deploy the models at scale. But those that just starting will see it quite soon after they just deploy it and spend some time. The model spend some time in production. They will understand that, hey, we have no idea how we manage our data or how we make sure that the data stays consistent. And yeah, the data integrity hasn't been compromised. Do you expect goals of the attackers change compared to what we see with the traditional cybersecurity?
Not really. I think the goals are still the same. I mean, they're typically monetary, although it tends to span to things from state actors like different political motivations. We've certainly seen that as well on the adversarial machine learning side. I think in the earliest days, and funny enough, I think we're a little bit past the early days here. You'll see things like a little bit more on the state actor side, a little bit more on things that are curated for specific attacks. And now we're also starting to see automation around these sorts of attacks. So many of the attacks, including one that I've lived through on the defender side, were definitely built around that specific attack. They were tailored to the actual engagement. But now we're starting to see attack tools pop up to the point where now to conduct these attacks, you don't need to be a data scientist. You don't need to be an exploit developer. You really just need to be able to download one of the many dozen tools that are available on GitHub and use them. So if you can engage with the menu, you can start launching these types of attacks. And what that means is now that it's the bar is that much lower for people to conduct these attacks, really all that needs to be there is the motivation, significant amounts of motivation for the attackers. This won't be the first type of technology that they decide not to learn how to attack and to get engaged in. So I think to tie it back to sort of the traditional cybersecurity types of attacks, you're looking at things like gaining access. You're looking at things like bypassing decision-making engine, and whether that engine is powered by machine learning or some sort of legacy technology. The motivations remain the same. They're typically financial. They're typically destructive. They're typically related to some sort of gaining entry or access to information that you otherwise shouldn't have. So really, I think this is just a new path to the existing same motivations that we've seen before: accessing networks, accessing environments, tampering with a product or service, and really it's all there. It's just a way in which that we're to bypass newer technology, but the newer technology is really supposed to be just an advancement of still trying to accomplish the same goals on the legitimate side. So we're going to see those same sort of attempts on those systems for the exact same motivations.
And do you think the importance of different types of attacks vary for different types of organizations, or it's quite similar?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's going to be very related to sort of what the organization's use cases are. And I do believe that there's some variance there. I think that there's organizations that are going to be a little more worried on inference for those who are potentially exposing their model through a product or web application, mobile application, what have you. And then I think there's organizations that are going to be a little bit more concerned with the data attacks, like things like poisoning. I give the example for healthcare. Healthcare is some of the earliest adopters in leveraging they have these massive data sets that they've accumulated over time. Some of them are patients, some of them are used for just different kind of patient dynamics or different things like around. They can be used to protect data sets that can be used around sort of disease to predict diagnoses. And so there's just large amounts of data there that can be used in drug trials. There's all these different use cases. And based on whether it's internal or based on whether you need to collect data from external sources or whether you need to provide predictions to external sources, that could totally change sort of the priority of what you need to think about in terms of an adversarial machine learning attack. Now, and all that being said, every step of the ML operations pipeline is certainly a vulnerability for every organization that's out there. But you just need to think of it from the eyes of an attacker and sort of what those motivations are, and that'll help you prioritize things. But ultimately, you're going to need coverage across them all. So, if you're a fraud organization, if you're detecting some sort of money out fraudulent transaction, you're probably going to be a little bit more interested in model tampering. You're going to be interested with somebody who's trying to understand how to bypass your machine learning fraud detection. And so you're going to be interested in sort of how your model is being inferred. And that's very important because those labels are by nature of what you do going to be exposed, whether or not you're labeling a transaction as fraud or whether you're allowing it. That's the label that the attacker needs. So as such, you need to be very aware of how they're interacting with that model. So it is going to be use case driven. But that being said, this can even be step 2 of a traditional cybersecurity attack where somebody gains access to your model through a traditional network attack. And now they have closer to that white box access to attack your IP or your sort of value proposition that brings in your revenue or whatever your model does. So it's really going to be just like any other sort of cybersecurity scale or model. It's something that you need to understand every step and every possibility with, and have a real security plan around all of them. But they could certainly change their priority, and that's all going to be based around your use case and what elements of your technology that exposes.
Let's talk about the full adversarial attack lifecycle. What can it look like from the attacker perspective?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's really going to be sort of a step-by-step basis. I think the attacker is going to start out in just like a normal kind of attack and in a traditional cybersecurity attack. They're going to have to do a little bit of reconnaissance. They're going to need to understand what they're up against. They're going to do things like understanding, did you home grow your models, or are you using something that is open source available, or did you train off of something that was available, or did you potentially go through some sort of transfer learning cycle where you purchased a model from another entity, and what can I find out about that? So step 1 is really understanding where things go and try and move it as far from that black box scenario to that white box scenario as possible. Then they're going to try and understand things like, how did you train your model? Is this data you collected internally? Is that something I can get my hands on? Or were you using databases or data sets that are available or that were accessed from the public? Because if so, that means I can probably go find data out about that and then understand things like, can I input labeling into that system for a potential poisoning scenario? So I think that kind of step of understanding, just kind of building that model in reconnaissance for what your MLOps pipeline looks like is that kind of entry level step. And then understanding what can happen. I think next is that inference component where you're trying to understand, okay, at the decision-making level, what is this model considering? What is it associating with high value? What is it associating with low value? And that can be a relatively complex thing to understand about a neural network or a deep level of, I think even on the legitimate side, we're still trying to work on model explicability right now. But that being said, what the attacker can infer about the explicability of this model is very, very important. And that can be done really working from the outside in of the inputs and outputs to that model and trying to either recreate a more explicable surrogate model is certainly a possibility there as well. And so there are many, many techniques to try and understand what that model puts a lot of stake in and what it doesn't really pay that much attention to. And so they really want to understand that level. And then that can go into the prediction side. And on the outputs of this model, where is it confident? Where is it of low confidence? And where can I possibly flip that switch for a label to be tampered with to the point to gaining the outcome that the threat actor is looking for? And that's sort of the decision time version of the attack. There's also many other ways that you can attack the infrastructure. There are really not that many tools out there that different organizations are using. So there's MLOps toolkits. There's sets that data scientists can use within a notebook. There are a pretty small list of tools that a data scientist is going to use to deploy. So those are things that an attacker is going to want to understand as well. And really, ultimately, that all lands towards things like, what can they abuse? And these are all sort of the true adversarial and machine learning attacks that we're talking about here now. But there's also ways in which this really overlaps well with traditional cybersecurity attacks. If I know what kind of tools you're up against, I can start looking for vulnerabilities in those tool sets. They can understand sort of where things are deployed and how they can how your model is stored, what kind of file format it is in, all these different levels that they can try and attack from some of the attacks that we're all a lot more used to, because those are certainly in play here as well. So I think it looks a lot like any other sort of attack on a network. It's really just embracing a different set of tools to understand a little bit more about adversarial machine learning and something that really used to be kind of considered almost secure through obscurity, but that's just not the case anymore with all the automated ways that this can be attacked. So the attacker lifecycle, it's a very familiar look, but honestly, it's a little bit more green field for them because of how much we are inherently just exposing machine learning to our customers and to the public.
So you expect this life cycle to evolve over time as they become more professional or more experienced at the attacks?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in sort of both directions, I expect them to get even more sophisticated as we move on. And I expect it to become even more available to, I think we always use the term script kiddies, right? But for those who can conduct attacks just using toolkits that are readily available, those are already available. They'll get even easier, and we'll start to see attack tools become, even to the point where we've looked at like attacking as a service and some of those things that are available. I'm sure that'll be adopted as well by the attacker side. So some of it may already be available. So I think that's stuff for us to be concerned with, because I think that we're going to see it growing in every direction. And then the more that we grow on the legitimate side, and the more we deploy and we start embracing AI at the edge even more, where we want these machine learning models to be available to interact with our customers and the public, because they bring so much advancement to our technology in general, and to whatever services we're offering or whatever our value proposition is. That's just going to increase that attack surface more and more and more. So we really just need to think of security like we are about every other level of this operations pipeline here. And it's something that we need to embrace even sooner. And again, these aren't lessons that are new. This is all things that we've seen before with any new emerging technology. So I do expect it to evolve. I expect it to become more and more common. And I think the biggest step to that, and the biggest sort of accelerator there, is just going to be the recognition amongst those who do want to commit malicious acts on what's already available to them. So as we see more and more of these appear in mainstream, as regulation starts catching up to what people even have to disclose around these kinds of attacks, it's going to become more and more attractive to those who weren't necessarily on the cutting edge, but certainly have the motivations to conduct them.
Growth in both scale and sophistication.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
And what does the defender perspective look like? What are the most important stages, activities there?
Yeah, that's really important. And again, I think it's going to be really well aligned with your use case, where you're sort of exposed. If you're collecting public data that's accessible by anyone, I mean, you're really going to be interested in sort of data augmentation attacks and how to monitor that level and see what's going on. If you're exposing your model's decisions, which many, many products and services are, you're going to want to pay attention to how that model is being interacted with. You're going to need to use a tool in order to understand that, which is exactly what the motivation was for HiddenLayer moving forward, was to be able to give people that real-time ability to detect attacks and respond to them. So you're going to need to embrace what's out there to be able to monitor and to detect and respond to what's going on. But at the same time, you really have to have a strong understanding of that flow of data and decision-making and what's happening when it comes outward, and how easy it would be to tamper with where you're at. And you need to consider all of these things. So it's really just like the attacker model. It's really a true reflection and trying to be as proactive as possible, but then also have the ability to respond in real time reactively, and shorten that reaction time for what's going on. But every step of the MLOps pipeline, it's your data, it's your candidate models, it's your model development in terms of that pipeline there, and then it's real time decision making, and then it's your evaluation and continuous learning stages as well. So they look similar. It's just a little bit of a cat and mouse, like it always is. But that being said, organizations have to be more proactive on this side, because they're very, very aggressively deploying machine learning, and not thinking very much about how often that could be exposed, or to what degree they're exposing it to those who are not trying to use it as intended.
When you talk to CISOs these days, what do you tell them how they should think about AI ML security?
Yeah, great question, and I think it's sort of the theme I'm saying here, which is essentially there's nothing new. This isn't a new pattern. I think whether it's any new evolution, any new technology also represents a new attack surface. And I think we've seen that in on the vendor side for the last 20 years. I think as soon as there's a new technology out there, a new associated security product goes alongside it. And so I tell CISOs you need to prioritize this, especially those who have made either enormous resource commitments to machine learning, which is really, almost every company out there today is a big data company. And all of them are employing machine learning models. Some of them are doing it sort of batch data retroactively, and they're a little less exposed. But again, it could certainly be part two of a traditional cybersecurity attack. And then many are at the forefront. We're looking at the deployment of models in production systems, and so they're certainly just as exposed. So to CISOs, I'm letting them know, look at this the same way you've looked at every other asset that you've ever had to protect in your career, because it's the same in many ways, but it's also even more exposed based on the fact that you want it to be exposed to the public. And so I think a lot of people in security just sort of think of machine learning and artificial intelligence as sort of this mystified entity that they'll never really understand. And that's not what it is. It's really it's a decision-making tool, just like anything else we've ever seen. And it can certainly be broken down, and it can certainly be attacked, and it can be protected. And it's not different in those regards. So I tell them to treat it just like anything else. And if it's valuable, protect it.
It is very dangerous to consider any tool that your organization deploy at scale as a mysterious and opaque and hard to understand.
Oh, yeah.
Because it will lead to terrible consequences down the road, that's for sure.
Well, I think there's to that point, I think that there's sort of a responsibility question that's out there. A lot of data scientists are saying, well, I know how vulnerable I am and I understand the technology, but I don't feel the responsibility of securing this organization. And then I think a lot of CISOs are saying, well, the responsibility to secure the organization is on me, but I don't understand these data science assets. And so I think one thing that we're really trying to do at HiddenLayer is really bridge the gap between those two traditional silos in an organization, because it really does require both right now. It requires the understanding of what's out there, and it also requires the desire and responsibility to protect it. And then I think that's we found that to be a little bit sort of specific to each organization right now. I think, again, those mature data science teams, they want to protect their assets. They want to protect what they've been working on. And I think we need to see that at the CISO level as well. Actually, Gartner just released a survey pretty recently saying that 53% of data science professionals and AI specialists believe that they are vulnerable and that they need to do something about that, whereas only about 25% of security operators and CISOs have said the same thing. So it's a little bit of an educational component right now. I mean, the answer should be 100% on both sides. There's no question whether or not something's exposed right now and whether or not it's being attacked. But it's just more about that awareness and really, where does that responsibility lie? So we've actually seen success there on the risk side of things. So if you look at organizations that potentially are looking at fraud, where those who are responsible for that are all reporting up to the same chief risk officer, they tend to be a lot more aligned because they're part of the same organization, and they've really established sort of the who owns what component of protecting those models. And so we've seen it successfully deployed, and we've seen that organizations be able to successfully understand what they need to do and how to move forward and assign budget and all of those things. So we just need to build that into more of our traditional model for any organizational level of security.
Is there some emerging blueprint for how to enable that collaboration between data teams, ML ops teams, ML engineering teams, and security teams at the organization? The one where they report to the same person is powerful because that person is obviously feels that their career is on the line.
Sure.
And they, will react to that. But in most organizations, it's not the case. So is there any early observations that you've made how to align them along the goal of protecting or enabling their AI security?
The first I saw that I liked a lot was out of Gartner as well, and it was TRISM, and it was really related to all responsible AI, and security was only one component of that. And I think that was a model that organizations can start to embrace as well. I do still think that there's a little bit of how to figure this out on the defender side. I think that we need to see this become a little more mainstream, and as we see more and more of these attacks become something just like a cybersecurity attack, a traditional cybersecurity attack that we're up against every day, we'll get better and better at it, absolutely. But even those broad level questions of who's responsible, what are the consequences, all of those things, they need to be commonplace, not just established at those sort of forward thinking organizations. And I think that'll help clear things out. I think there are some responsible AI frameworks. And again, they're a little more broad. They're looking at things like explicability of the model, fairness of the model, making sure they're representing all groups equally, that kind of thing, which is extremely important. but security tends to be sort of a component of that in some of the existing models. I would advocate for security first to be able to even protect that model, because how can you even be aware of what you're trying to maintain isn't influenced by an attacker or anything along those lines. So I think we have a lot to do on the modeling side. And I think a little bit of that will be organizational specific, but we'll start to create some sort of archetypes of how to approach that depending on what your organization looks like. And we're certainly still in our infancy in that approach, but it'll continue to grow. But again, I think TRISM is a good first step that came out of Gartner. And I think there's others that we'll see starting to develop.
There's a lot to be done to ensure high level of AI security at the organizations. Let's talk about your approach to solving the AI security challenges we talked about. How do you address them with the HiddenLayer platform?
We really wanted to, we thought about a few things as we approached this problem space. And number one, we thought about how widespread it's going to be. And as a result, we wanted to create a highly distributable solution. So we knew that solution needed to be a product and not a service. We can certainly help with services in terms of learning about it and deploying the product ultimately. And that's certainly something we can help those who are looking for it. But that being said, there's not that many adversarial ML specialists on the planet. So when you think about this as a solution for all of the commercial enterprise, for all of the federal government, everything out there, we're going to need a highly distributable product. There was some academic research done in this space too. And people have looked at sort of mitigation techniques through robustness, or essentially saying, let us help you build your model to be more and more complex so that an inference attack or something along those lines takes longer and there's more hurdles in place. And as security specialists, and from those of us approaching this from a security standpoint, we didn't really love that as a comprehensive solution, because that's delaying the inevitable. And when these attacks were manual, it was certainly it represented some sort of struggle or increased friction in that inference attack. But now that these attacks are becoming automated, that I don't believe that really does much in terms of slowing an attacker down. So rather than going through this idea of robustness or complexity, you can think of it sort of like a complex password, right? So a complex password is going to take a little bit longer for a hash cracker. In some cases, a lot longer for a hash cracker to crack your password. But that only works because you reset your password every 60 days or whatever your policy is. It's not something that you can do with your ML ops pipeline. So we wanted to create a solution that was, number one, highly distributable, but number two, preventative in nature, and one that could identify an attacker in real time in a production system and then respond to it. And that can't be done through those mitigation techniques. So that all of those lessons we learned on the EDR and XDR space, which is where we are from, and as well as attacks that we had to respond to in security, we wanted to create a platform that could handle that in real time. And then lastly, we didn't want you to have to be a data scientist in order to use it. We wanted someone with security operations expertise, just like working in a SOC or something along those lines, to be able to use this product to protect their assets and then escalate to the data scientists. So if they understand that an attack happened, they can, within our toolkit and also within sort of their same set of tools, like in a SIM, which we integrate in, so they don't have to change, security professional wouldn't have to change their tool sets. They could identify an attack, they could stop it, and then they could escalate that to the data science team and say, here's what was being attacked. If we want to redeploy something, or if we want to redevelop some element of the MLOps pipeline there, they'd be able to do that. So we really wanted to take that approach. And so we built what we call machine learning detection and response as an evolution from endpoint detection and response. And that is a tool that you deploy alongside your model, very, very lightweight. And what it does is it measures the behaviors of those who are interacting with your model. And we measure that in dozens and dozens of different ways, about 60 different ways that we analyze that behavior. And we look at those dynamic behaviors and understand whether or not somebody is using your model as intended, or whether or not they're tampering or performing those inference attacks or potentially poisoning any of those pieces. And the reason that that's important is because we want it to be non-invasive as well. So we don't want to have to go to a customer and say, give us all your data and give us your algorithms, and then we can protect them, because that's going to create a lot of friction too. So by measuring these behaviors, we can actually protect these models without ever having to see any raw data or without having to get into the algorithms themselves. And that allows us to detect and respond to these attacks. And so the detection is pretty obvious. We detect that somebody's performing inference, or we detect that they're poisoning or any of these components, but we had to create some response options, because in a real world environment, they need to be able to react. And so we have many. We have the ability to cut the requester off, the person who's accessing the model. We can also rate limit them and watch them a little bit closer and see what's going on. And then it starts to get interesting, because we can actually intentionally poison their outputs. So if somebody is trying to steal your model, maybe we don't just want to cut them off. Maybe we actually want to mislead them and start changing some weights and biases and giving them an altered gradient and send them down the wrong pathway. So as you mentioned earlier, on those questions around model extraction, if we mislead somebody who's trying to steal your model, we can make sure that we stay at the forefront of whatever our technology is. And then lastly, we wanted to embrace our abilities as threat intelligence professionals, and we actually can recreate a model and reroute that requester to it. So it can be a version of your model, or it can be a completely different model. That part doesn't matter. But what we can do is then watch them in a white box scenario in our environment. And that's important because we can actually start performing attribution. We can see who was conducting these attacks, start naming state actors, start naming attack groups that were associated with them, learn things about how they are conducting the attacks, how long it would have taken them to be successful, what data they would have stolen, that kind of thing. And we can give that back to that organization. And so those response mechanisms are very, very important as well, as we've learned in every other cybersecurity realm.
Going on the offensive, literally.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that becomes important in competitive scenarios. That becomes important in those tailored access scenarios where it may be a state actor who's trying to do everything they can. And so to be able to mislead them, to slow them down, get them burning their resources, that becomes very attractive to a defensive organization.
One thing is monitoring the behavior of the actors interacting with the model. The other one is also the data, the new data that coming into the training set for the model. Do you look at that data to see if there are any shifts and notify users about those shifts?
No, we don't look at the data internal to the data itself, but we do look at metadata to understand things like what's changing. Is there a big artificial shift in something about that data? And at the input level of your model, what's going into your model? So essentially drift. Are we seeing some drift? Are we seeing consistent drift? Or are we just seeing anomalies? We alert that kind of level because we can still inform a data science team there without having to actually look at the data itself. So that data can still remain private, but we can look at things like the distribution of that data, the shape of that data, things that are still relatively contextless to us, so we can protect you without having intimate knowledge or requiring you to divulge anything that you don't want to divulge. So absolutely, we have solutions for the data side. We have solutions for model integrity. So that's going to become very, very important when you think about all this transfer learning we've been discussing or using open source models. At the moment, it's really the only mechanism we've ever found to ensure that the model that you downloaded is the same model that left the station, or the model that you purchased, or the model that you were using in your environment yesterday. You need to have a solution in mind to even ensure that's the same model. And when you think about all of the critical applications of models today, whether it's being used in self-driving cars or surgeries or investments all live, you need to ensure that model is the one that you expect it to be. Especially when you look at some of the techniques out there we've seen for launching executable code through models. We can actually look at ransomware being launched through models now. So having an integrity solution at the model level is very important. Understanding the data as it's shaped and as it's coming into your model is very important. The model at decision time as well. And then downstream of that, when you actually look at model performance over time and the evaluation and continuous learning, really where it all becomes the same thing, where you're using model performance to retrain future models. So we have to protect every single step, and we do.
Let's say an organization adopted HiddenLayer. How would different people at the organization use it in their day-to-day work to ensure high level of AI security?
Yeah, great question. And then really there's two sort of broad work streams there. And that's sort of at the defensive level, really what the tool was designed to be for a security operations specialist. So it can be used at the SOC to detect those kinds of attacks in real time, respond to them in real time in a very, very simple way. But then it can also be used by the data scientist to have a deeper understanding of how that model is being used over time by all of its requesters, what that distribution looks like. So even though we're protecting the model at that level and they can understand things like where the model is most vulnerable, they're also starting to see information like usages, because we are in production and we are providing some in production information there. They can also use this tool to understand how the model is being used, what drift looks like, where it's most effective, where all the analysis and the things that they're doing up front and parsing and vectorizing, all of those things that come alongside a model, how much of it is needed and how much of it, what's going on. So there's certainly some optimization data we provide, but the point for us being there is really about the security. So you have the workflow of the security operations specialist. That's very easy, already integrating with the SIM tooling and SOAR tooling that they're already using. And then you also have the ability for the data scientist to dive a little bit in, look at some dashboards, look at some understanding at a high level of how and a deep level of how their model is being used. And then when there was a security incident, is there more proactive things they can do around any sort of redeployment of the model or changing of its architecture or anything that will help them? So We have sort of the quick and dirty on the security side. Make sure you're protected. Make sure that you're responding. And then we also have the ability to dive a little bit deeper, learn more about how your model is being used and how requesters are interacting with it for the data scientists.
And enabling the partnership between data science and security.
Extremely important to us. Absolutely. We really want to help be a bridge there. We want to get those two organizations speaking the same language. We want to get them understanding each other very well, because there really is not a future for ML deployment without a strong cooperation between security and data science.
Are there any important differences between your approach to solving this and what else is available in the market?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think most of what's available today really is more on that services side, where they're saying, again, let us help you build your model to be more robust. Let's inject some noise into that model so we can mitigate these sorts of attacks. And I think, again, that was a great first step at the time. And when these attacks were manual, it certainly was, a step in the right direction of an effective defense. But for us, it's really not a comprehensive approach. It requires too much access. It requires access to algorithms. It requires access to data. It requires a services approach. So it requires somebody on site with you, playing with your model, helping you build your model in different ways. And it's just not scalable to a solution, especially when you see these organizations that are deploying 60 different types of models and 60 different use cases all across their environment. They need a generic solution. And so, we created one. And that was important because it's a generic solution for a very generic problem. But data science deployment today is relatively generic. There's only a handful of tools being used. And there's MLOps deployments, there's model deployments from different sort of Python kits that are out there, but we wanted to make sure that it's something that everyone could use. So I would say the major differentiators are that we are a product, and we are driven by being a highly easy to use and easy to deploy and easy to distribute across all of your assets. And then we are non-invasive. We don't want to see your data. We don't want to see the insides of your algorithms. We just want to protect them based on those behaviors. And I think those are the biggest differentiators for us.
Shifting from services to a product solution is what we observed in all other areas of security. So that's inevitable. And making it easy to deploy and less specific to a certain environment and more general, that's definitely also a very important thing. Whatever needs a lot of maintenance and a lot of setup and then a lot of changes along the way will not be properly adopted, that we've seen in previous cybersecurity technologies.
Yeah, very well said. We've learned that lesson many times too, right? It tends to, if you can integrate with an existing workflow, or if you can make things easier on the operators themselves, which is absolutely an important thing for us, then that's, especially when you're asking somebody to deal with a new market here, a brand new area of adversarial machine learning. I mean, they need to understand how it can be a part of their day-to-day and how it can be easy to use and clearly understood of what's happening right now. So if we don't do all of those things, we're never going to create that bridge between the two organizations, and we're never going to get the level of adoption to keep up with the level of attacks that are going on out there.
Exactly. Let's talk about the origins of HiddenLayer. What became the trigger for you to start the company?
Yeah, great question. Actually, this is really born out of an event. So my co-founders and I worked for an organization called Cylance, and Cylance was a very, very interesting organization, as it took an existing cybersecurity market in antivirus, and it took a major step forward. And to give you a little bit of background there, for a long time, antivirus was really just a list of bad things, whether it was bad behaviors or bad artifacts. We looked at sort of whether or not any of those bad things ever made it onto your environment. And that was relatively successful when we had nothing going on. But what that meant was any new attacks never made it to that list until somebody had attacks. So some of these large antivirus organizations that had tens of thousands of customers, it was fine because they would wait for one of their customers to get hit, and then they would now have the attack, and then they would give it to the rest of their customers. And I think that's not ideal if you're the company got hit, but that's sort of the approach. So Cylance was a huge step forward, and they essentially used machine learning. They trained on a whole bunch of threats, and they trained on a whole bunch of benign samples, and then they were able to identify whether or not a threat that they had never seen before, or samples of whether they'd never seen before, was actually a threat, or whether it was benign software. So that was an incredibly interesting place for me to go, and so I thought, hey, this is fantastic. And so we, while we were there, both myself and my two co-founders were there. Actually, the majority of the HiddenLayer company is from Cylance. We had actually experienced one of those inference attacks that I was talking to you about. So back in 2019, we were under attack by an organization that actually we wouldn't have even known they were doing it had they not published about it and they not bragged about it. So very scary, because that was really our that was the bread and butter of the organization. That was what our value proposition was. So me and a few others led the response effort, and took a very, very long time. Was very expensive to deal with, months and months of sort of redeploying and understanding how far back we had to go. All that same issue we just described earlier. And then afterwards, the dust settled, and myself, Tanner, and Jim, my co-founders, kind of looked at each other and said, "This is going to be an enormous problem for anyone who's deploying machine learning assets into their production systems." So that really inspired the idea for HiddenLayer. And we had sort of wanted to focus on that adversarial ML problem for a long time. And then that real world event really kind of sparked it. So that's really a kind of our origin story. And we're a great group that's been together for a long time. Actually, Tanner, Jim, and I have worked with the last 5 organizations together. When you work with some folks that have the data science and cybersecurity expertise, that's really not all that common. So it's good to stay together as we kind of move on. But so we had worked at a few different organizations, and then finally saw that the time was right to found HiddenLayer and starting to see this problem take off. So that's how it all happened.
Working together at 5 different organizations, you said?
That's right. Yeah, we were together at Cylance. So Jim Ballard and I have known each other a very, very long time. We grew up together. And then Tanner Burns was one of the first people I hired at Cylance. We were there. Then we were there through the acquisition for Cylance at BlackBerry. They were purchased. Then we went over to an organization called Agari, and we helped them build machine learning models to detect phishing attacks and social engineering attacks through email content. It was very, very interesting. Then that company was acquired by a group called Help Systems, which had a whole bunch of different areas and big data offerings from all these different organizations. So that was fantastic to work with there. And then we went over to Qualys and helped them establish their data science team, because they have some phenomenal data over there and some great insights that machine learning is going to be able to take advantage of. And I guess HiddenLayer will be the 6th. So we've spent a good time together, and we really kind of know each other very well, and strengths and weaknesses and all that. So it's a great founding team.
It is as great founding team as one can have. Did it take any convincing on one of the co-founders' part to convince other co-founders to make the jump and get into HiddenLayer, or was it completely organic? You were on the same page?
Very much on the same page. I think we all know how big of a problem this is going to be, and I think I know we're in the thick of it every day, but we truly believe that protecting ML assets is going to be bigger than protecting operating systems. I think when you look at how this problem is growing, and even conservative estimates from groups like PwC believes that at 2030 AI and ML will be about a $15.6 trillion business, and so when you think about that level of scale, of course that a solution like this is going to be required, and just in general, like a societal need is going to be to protect these assets. So I think we're all believers. We all understand how big of an issue this is. We're trying to get more people in this space. We're trying to get others. We want some more competitors. We want some more areas and existing networks to think about this. And so, we're really trying to grow it. But I think we all sort of look at this the same way. And it didn't require any convincing or anything like that, because it's really a true mission for the 3 of us.
We used to say that software is eating the world, and now machine learning is eating the software.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great way to look at it, because it's true. I mean, I think when you look at what is going to become machine learning and what is going to become artificial intelligence, big data is going to become artificial intelligence. Operating systems will become it. I mean, technology will become it. I think, it's the technology for the foreseeable future, and we're getting better and better at it every day. We're getting better at deploying it. We're getting better at leveraging it. It's becoming easier to do with tools, and there's more and more use cases, and we're just getting better at understanding the value in the deployment of it and making the correct decisions with data. So that's only going to accelerate. That's not going to slow down. So, the need to protect it is only going to grow as well.
It will. As an entrepreneur, you don't build products. You build a company that builds products. How do you think about this? What kind of people, processes, and culture is needed to succeed?
Yeah, very, very well said. And I have strong feelings here. I think 80% of an organization's success is determined by who comes in and who are the people that build that organization. And we hear about culture and culture fit all the time. And the only thing I really think when I think about what is the culture of an organization is who's there and what do they believe and care about. And I think building the right team is how you build a successful company. And that's the strength behind HiddenLayer. We've been very fortunate to work with a lot of fantastic people and cybersecurity and data science over many years. And so getting those folks involved in HiddenLayer and the true best of the best is really why we've been so successful so far, and why we're going to continue to be very successful, because it is the right people, which makes it the right culture. And so I think my advice to any entrepreneur in this space and really trying to build anything is think long and hard about who's coming on board, and spend a lot of time interviewing, and spend a lot of time, getting the right people in, because from that point on, execution and all the things that have to happen, everything will be affected by the people that you brought into your organization. So it's just so important. I would characterize it as 80% of your success overall is going to be based on the team that you built. And so really everything's a sort of a symptom of that. When you start getting into the processes and you start getting into the values and how you execute and how you attack a problem, it's all going to be based on the people. So I can't stress that enough. I think that's something that I believe in quite heavily, and we're very lucky that we have a lot of people who want to come work with us. And so we don't have to do a whole lot in the way of recruiting and that kind of thing. But that won't always be the case once we get to a certain scale. And it just becomes so important to make sure you're bringing the right people in who share your motivations, who share your values, share your work ethic. And then, obviously you want to make sure that they feel passionate about what you're doing, but you also want to make sure that they have a good balance in their life, and it's a healthy level of interaction with what you're trying to accomplish. And so all of that is just going to come out of bringing the right people on, and those who really know how to attack the problem in the same way that you envision it being solved.
Speaking about bringing the right people in, how do you approach hiring new team members? What do you look for, and when the candidate is clearly not a fit?
Yeah, great question. I think this is something that even back in the Cylance days when I was growing out the threat research team there, something that we believe very strongly, and I believe very strongly was, again, that fit, that personality. There were certainly many higher qualified, more technically capable people that we didn't bring onto the team because we didn't think they'd be a great fit. We didn't think they'd have a great attitude. And so me personally, I put a lot of emphasis on educating and empowering each other. And I don't mean education in terms of like institutional education or anything. I actually have many problems with that. But I think that when you talk about empowering each other, like, today, can I look back at today and say that I taught someone something and I learned something from somebody? And I think those who really value that, and you can do everything through that. You can mentor, you can sell through education, you can build through education. I mean, through all of that. So I look for that. I look for those who are interested in empowering others and interested in being empowered by those around them. And that tends to work the rest out. I mean, I think if people have that value in them, then they're probably hard workers. They're probably interested. And we look for those things. And then, I think the more your organization scales, the more you have to try and create a system around that. But that's the theme of it. So for instance, Cylance went through a huge hypergrowth phase, and we had to build that team out quite heavily. So it's no longer going through your Rolodex and bringing in good people. It's trying to meet somebody and decide if they'll be a great fit. So trying to measure things is certainly important. And there has to be, some bar of entry at the technical level. You absolutely want to get some talented folks there. So you really want to try and measure what's important there. You don't just want to go through any traditional means. You don't want to just go see where they got their degree and assume everything's great. You want to understand things like, what are the domains that we work in, and how skilled are you in those domains? Do you have strengths that outweigh your weaknesses and that kind of thing? So I usually build a system around that, and I tend to come up with rubrics associated. Like for instance, at Cylance, so I established 8 different domains that they had to have an understanding in, and that we were a team of malware reverse engineers. So it was things like different operating systems and different types of threats and different types of code, and so you really get to understand somebody and their skills in those environments. And then beyond that, it's really more of that kind of cultural fit and how do you feel and what's important to you. And then really, I think you put a little bit more weight on that than you do on the technical capabilities, because you can teach anybody. I used to say, once you're on my team, I'll teach you how to turn a computer on. I don't care. But it's really more about whether or not you're going to embrace what's around you and take advantage of it. And everyone can learn something from everybody. So, you can always, you're a teacher too. And those who really want to embrace that, that just to me is such a leading indicator for how they're going to handle every other element of what's going to be required for them in a position like that. So I think that's how I would sort of characterize what I look for.
Someone who's ready to contribute to the success of others and who's ready to learn themselves from others.
Yeah, well said. That's it.
Did you have a case when someone was just great on the technical side of things and you had to turn that person down because it didn't match that quality?
Dozens of cases just like that. I think there are phenomenal people out there. I mean, in technical capacities. And I think we certainly have a shortage on cybersecurity and data science. It's hard to say no to somebody who's technically competent, but you have to think about what that does to your organization and who people want to work with and how they fit in. And most people are especially when you get to this level of your sort of political, you're no longer a generalist. Now you're more of a specialist. Most people either think they're doing a great job or want to. And so it's at that point, it's really more about what fuels them, what motivates them, and does it align? But yeah, absolutely. I think both at Cylance, at all of my last organizations I worked at, many interviews with just phenomenal people who, in terms of their technical capabilities. But then you kind of, hey, have you given examples of people you've worked with or people you've helped out? And, people talk about, I just want to be left alone, or I just want to do my checklist and be done for the day. I mean, that's not the kind of people where you're looking for when you're building a team, especially in a new market and a new type of emerging threat. So, you need people who can thrive off of each other. And there's ways to do that in an introverted capacity too. It's certainly not, saying that everyone has to be like a big teamwork person all the time in front of everybody, but there's certainly like a value alignment there in terms of how you can empower others and where you can learn from them.
A startup has too many problems to deal with during the early days and just cannot afford having people who are not aligned with the values.
Yeah, prioritization is everything. I mean, because you can't solve all the problems, and so if your values are out of line or your motivations are out of line, then out of alignment, you're gonna start seeing way more of those problems, be at the front and center stage versus just things that you have to prioritize around. So yeah, absolutely right.
Large organizations can digest a lot of misalignment issues because they're already large. They have moats around them. They have processes, systems. Not a startup.
No, we can't compartmentalize. We're all wearing, 5 or 6 hats right now. So there's no way around that teamwork element. And I think the successful organizations, even at a large scale, still maintain an element of that. I think there are certainly organizations who compartmentalize very well. Like Microsoft's a fantastic example of an organization that compartmentalizes very, very well, where you have almost all these little like individual businesses as part of the same business, and there's success there. But I think there's also examples of those who can really take ownership of and seek exposure all around them, and that's how you really stay true to whatever problem you're trying to solve. And so I think even if you grow to one of these large, massive organizations, the very successful ones, at least at a leadership level, still have that sort of startup mentality.
Yeah, and value alignment, at least at the most critical parts of your organization, even if it's already a large one. Talking about you personally, you're a certified ethical hacker. I was curious, what does this mean?
That means I passed a multiple choice test one day a long time ago. It doesn't mean a whole lot in terms of the actual certification, but the role is important. And back in the earlier days, we were doing red teaming exercises to help an organization understand where they're weak. So you essentially hack an organization and tell them how you did it, and that's done in a very well understood way, and it's done with rules of engagement and all kinds of stuff. And certainly used to do some of that, but it really what that means. And I think the broader, in a broader sort of essence of what that means is you're trying to understand the attacker and the attacker mindset and applying that from a responsible or in a responsible way to have an understanding and to help an organization understand where an attacker would take advantage of them or abuse them or something along those lines. So yeah, I think that's an important sort of mindset you have to have. And whether you're gone through a career like mine, where you spent more time on the sort of vendor side of security products, or whether or not you're a defender from a CISO's organization where you're trying to keep the bad guy out, where you might be even a little bit closer to something like that, where you're employing and you're working with certified ethical hackers to understand more about where you're going to be weak and potentially be proactive about finding some of those potential vulnerabilities. And because as much as you can use tooling and what's out there, and everything is going to be specific to an organization and their implementation. So having that sort of personalized understanding of the findings of a red teaming engagement is certainly helpful. But I think the kind of broader message there is I'm somebody who studies and understands the sort of black hat side of things and what the attacker is going to do. For me, that was in reverse engineering malware and how malware is constructed. And then ultimately, as I became a security leader, trying to understand different problems that organizations face from both the attack side and defender side. And so I think that's probably the best answer for what that means.
How did you get involved? What drew you there?
There's a few things. I think, just being highly interested in technology as a kid. And, I used to get really interested in programming languages. I remember my third grade teacher, actually, I think about her quite often because she was somebody who really encouraged me in that regard, and even found a way to bring an old computer in so I could do different programming exercises at that stage, and learn how to, type code to interact with robotics and things that were really just starting to come around when I was a kid. And I think that was a big issue. And then I got into bug bounties when I was a little bit older, because it was cool to make a little bit of money off of those things. And I did a few of them for different like audio software groups and those just things that were exposed to a lot of people. So like video games were a great way to try and get bug bounties, or anything that you could just go interact with online for free and try and find holes in it and that kind of thing. So that became interesting. And then, it naturally grew into a way to earn some money as a job. So I had an old IT job where I was actually, that's a sad story. I automated my job away at one location. They hired me to log into a whole bunch of doctors and dentist offices to help them upgrade their security software. And I was like, we don't have to do all that. And I just wrote a script and launched it overnight and solved everybody's problem. And they said, hey, great, we don't need you anymore. So, you start to learn some of that. And then you have, okay, well, if I'm going to be on the automation side of things, I need to find ways to do that at a grander scale with a little bit more longevity in terms of a career. So I got into that, and then started, I worked at a company for a while called the Media Trust, which was a really interesting one because they would see a lot of well-funded state actor threats as well. So that was very interesting on the reverse engineering side. And then I moved on to Cylance from there, and the rest I think I've already told. But yeah, I think it's really just born out of interest and really just access, and just what the internet really brought to those who like poking around and seeing what they can break, and then just figuring out what kind of career can come out of that.
You're also a poker player. I wonder if you see any skills transfer to security.
I actually do. Yeah, I do. I think poker is an interesting kind of hobby for me. I love to play poker, and I've liked it for a long time, and I do think so. I think it's funny. Nobody playing poker thinks they're bad at poker, so it's always fun to kind of go to a table and see what you find out, and watch people's betting patterns and see what you can learn about them. And I used to keep diligent notes about what people would do and what they would do in certain scenarios and that kind of thing. And I think it's very similar to the kind of cat and mouse game that you see with the attackers to a network and defenders for that network, and really trying to understand what's real and what's a potential bluff, and what's what kind of patterns are you seeing, and how would you interact with those patterns. So I think it's a great kind of sort of mirrored model for how you would win a poker game and win a hand of poker, versus trying to understand what's coming at a network or an adversarial machine learning operations scenario. I think there is some alignment there. It's also very math driven. So for those who are on the data science side, 90% of poker is pretty simple math. But I think that's there's definitely some alignment there. That's probably why I'm drawn to it.
Gotcha. Let's turn to the future now. What are your long-term goals for the company?
A great question. I think we need to scale with the problem. I think I think we need to grow, and we need to aggressively build a solution for this problem as fast as we can, and really not be so retroactive like every other sort of security implementation that we've seen. So I think the 20 or so different types of security products that are out there now that have come years and years after the need. We want to get ahead of that. So I think my goal is for us to stay as close or get in front of adversarial attacks on the machine learning side. And again, really in a scalable way that's easy to use. So that growth can come in many different forms, but it really needs to come in a way that those who need some sort of security solution are ready at the time they need to be ready. That's my true goal. And really whatever form that takes, we'll see. The future will tell, but we need to continue building the right team. And I think we've done a phenomenal job of that. I'm so lucky to work with the team that's here. And I'm just so excited that those who have joined have been, ready to join this mission, and they see the problem and how it's exploding around us and want to do something about it. But I'm excited because it's the right people and all the roles that we have. So just continue to grow and empower ourselves to be able to solve the problem at different levels, and find out what customers need and want, and make sure that we're matching that, and really trying to create a pragmatic solution for a true problem that seems, nebulous or seems like encumbering to a lot of organizations, but in reality, it's a lot more real and pragmatic than people think. So I think we want to make sure that we're building a solution that really solves problems for people who need those problems to be solved. So that's truly it. I know that's sort of a broad answer, but I think that we just need to make sure that we're empowering ourselves to be able to solve this problem, and that's going to require growth. And so as long as we're focused on that and making sure that we're always focused on the needs of the customer, then we're going to be in great shape.
We need such organizations as HiddenLayer that stay at the edge of the AI security and lead the industry in terms of the protection there. How do you see the future of AI security? What should we expect?
I'm really seeing it. I'm seeing AI security really align with transfer learning. I think that lack of professionals that are out there is really creating a scenario where organizations, you have model builders and then you have buyers of those models. And I think we're seeing that in the open source side with different like OpenAI and Hugging Face and some of those organizations out there that are really trying to allow access to machine learning for the organizations that used to have to home grow it. And I think that's phenomenal. But that's also creating a sort of another layer that can be abused with in terms of where adversarial attacks can get involved. And so I see it looking very much almost like vulnerabilities and exploits look like, where you see sort of a traditional well-known model and pre-built attacks for those models. And by the way, we're already seeing pre-built attacks in well-known attack tools like Counterfeit from Microsoft or Adversarial Robustness Toolbox from IBM or any of the other dozen that are on GitHub right now that actually show the silence attack as part of their motivation for existing. So I think that we really need to embrace the fact that there's automation behind these, both on the attacker and defender side. And I think we need to look at building a solution that will fit in well with that model, because that's what's going to come out of these attacks from attackers, and really what's going to fit in well with defender workflows. So I think we need to focus a lot on sort of that distribution of artificial intelligence and how those who are actually going to use these models are implementing them. And in order to do that, I think we need to focus on transfer learning, and we need to focus on sort of the model for which models are going to be in play or are going to be used by these organizations, and identify these patterns. And if we work out from there, I think we'll solve real world problems. But I think based on that sort of scarcity of professionals who can create models and leverage them and use them and apply them in production systems, I think we're going to see a lot of building in one organization and buying and using in another. And I think we need to focus hard on that relationship in order to secure it.
We see shortage there. We also see shortage, as you mentioned before, in adversarial machine learning experts, AI security experts. Both roles will be in high demand in the future. So if you want to future-proof your career, looking at AI security seems to be a very safe bet.
I agree. I agree. I think that's something that I think we need to see it make its way out of academia as well. I mean, I think that there's some phenomenal work going on at some of the universities, but I think we need to have a hard, long focus on how to make it more applied in today's production systems. And I think people who are looking at what industry to get into that know they're interested in some form of technology should absolutely embrace artificial intelligence and then evolve that into adversarial machine learning and MLSec, because there's going to be an enormous need for it. I think there's going to be a bigger need for that than we've ever seen in any other security implementation. And those are my beliefs and my thoughts, but I think we're going to start seeing them really come to fruition.
Yeah, it's not very hard to come to the same conclusions from the first principles, just seeing the adoption, the power of ML technologies today and what can come in the future from overall AI. And obviously, if we have thriving cybersecurity field for the traditional software, we will have just as thriving one for AI security as well. Where would you point people interested to learn more about AI security and stay current with the developments in the field?
Yeah, the first place I'd point you is actually to the research that's posted on HiddenLayer.com. I think that's we've got some fantastic content there aimed at both sort of high level, those who are just trying to learn more about the space and deal with it as sort of like a business impact level. And then we have some lower level technical blogs that talk more about the attack types and how they would conduct them. We're going to continue to post. And we're actively working today on a video campaign to show different types of attacks, give some real world examples there too. That'll be available in the near future. And then I would also recommend checking out MITRE Atlas. I think that they have a phenomenal sort of database of events that have happened. There's different sort of adversarial databases that are about to start popping up as well. But within with MITRE Atlas, you can actually go through different techniques and tactics that have been defined, and you can start looking at sort of how that would apply. And that's done from a nonprofit organization like MITRE that's really aimed at really what the form of this is going to be like moving forward. So I think that's fantastic. And then there's phenomenal white papers from different organizations. There's great work coming out of Toronto, Montreal, the Silicon Valley, and all the different East and West Coast organizations and universities that are addressing this. So tons of fantastic like white papers at the academic level. But if you're not ready for that much of a deep dive, I would say check out our blog, and there are some deeper things there that can help kind of get you ready for that as well. So there's tons of content.
I'll link to your research and to MITRE Atlas.
Thank you.
Chris, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Artem. It was fantastic.
Thank you for listening. You can learn more about HiddenLayer and follow their research on their website. You can also follow them on Twitter and LinkedIn. HiddenLayer is recruiting additional design customers. This is a unique opportunity to get their expertise and tailored services for your organization. Contact them to learn more. The links will be in the show notes.